gaming industry. My name is Paul Hancock and I'm from Ranger Ford. In today's webcast I'm joined by Chris Wright and Mark Roberts from IBM. Chris will be covering the gaming industry and Mark will be providing an overview of DevOps. If you have any questions, please enter them in the questions feature and we'll answer them at the end of the webcast. Today's agenda is based upon the challenges we see with our customers in the gaming industry. The areas we'll cover are how speed and being first to market is a crucial success factor within the gaming industry, to be able to move at speed and be agile whilst also having the ability to innovate and keep control, ensuring you're getting more from your existing IT estate and having less reliance on third parties, deliver more functionality more frequently and meet demanding and changing customer requirements, and finally, how you can automate processes and reduce delivery cycles. For now, I'll pass over to Chris Wright to cover off our view of the gaming industry. Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the trends and the overview of what's making this industry as exciting and as innovative as we're seeing. Just looking at the revenue figures is illuminating in itself. So I have some here on the slide from 2013, where we saw China, where I think we all realized that gaming is a big deal. In the space of that 12-month period, saw a 34% increase in games revenue. It's also worth noting that the gaming revenue, and I'm talking about all sorts of interactive games here, across the world is now on a par with the movie industry, $24 billion in 2013. So these are quite startling. Another piece that's adding to this is that the gaming audience is becoming increasingly diverse. So we're now seeing women account for effectively a fair share of gaming involvement. So we're looking at 47% in the United States, and the trend is upwards from 42% in 2012. And as these trends continue, this growth trend for audience and revenue, we're seeing the technological side respond by providing more games, more channels, more opportunities to play, and multi-channel is both an opportunity and a challenge, and we need to look at how the industry responds to these. Looking more locally at the British gambling industry as opposed to the entire gaming industry, we're still seeing a measure of growth, 7%. 2013, so that translates to nearly £500 million, not dollars, in that period. It's a very significant amount of money, and we're looking at the non-remote betting sector representing 51%. So the remote betting sector is nearly half of the entire pie here. Looking across the gaming sector as a whole, we're seeing growth across all sectors except for the arcade sector, which is the traditional seaside slot machine sector. But included in that growth is obviously the online sector that we're specifically interested in. Now, growth on this sort of scale does provide a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges. And some of the challenges, I'm just going to dwell on a couple of pieces, we're very familiar with from other industries outside of the gaming. These are traditional IT challenges. So, for example, infrastructure scale. The traditional IT model is that we tend to design systems that are built to take the heaviest load, and in many industries that load is more or less predictable across a 365-day scale. When you get into the two industries that really buck this trend are probably gaming and broadcasting, both of which have the luxury of seeing enormous spikes in the viewing figures. So an event such as the Grand National will hit both of these industries equally. Everyone will turn on their television, everybody will place a bet, and this is driving much, much larger audiences compared to the business as usual, day-by-day piece. So there's an interesting piece to ponder there, because the implication is that if we design for maximum usage, infrastructure can be left idle for most of the time. The other piece that comes along with multi-channel, as we're providing more channels for people to play by, we're receiving by default much more information about our players. A simple login is accompanied by a profile. We have the opportunity here to get to know the customer a lot better. We can get to know when they play games, which games they prefer, what their winning losing profile looks like, and start to build up a very detailed picture about that customer. And this, I think, is something new for the gaming industry in the sense that if we go back to look at the sort of bricks and mortar industry, individuals in a betting shop would recognize the person coming in off the street, possibly after the 5th or 6th visit, and start to get a feel. But that doesn't translate for the business into an opportunity which allows the business to make offers and encourage that person to continue betting with the same business. So using typically analytics and enterprise marketing tools, we can get to know our customers a lot better. We can take steps to prevent that customer moving on to another business much more efficiently. And perhaps most significantly, we can actually understand the return on investment on any targeted offer that we make. So we can start to plan promotions based on individual preferences, and this has proved to be hugely effective in actually getting people to be more responsive and giving them an experience, a customer experience that they're going to be more satisfied with. Now, with all of this opportunity comes a certain penalty as far as the IT department is concerned, because with innovation being driven at the pace it is, demand, we've got customer-facing applications, we've got a demand for new features, we want more useful and engaging games, we want to keep our customers playing. And this delivery of new function is absolutely now part of a competitive landscape. It's almost an arms race. And what we're seeing in terms of development pressures is really quite significant. We're seeing much faster deployment cycles, very frequent code drops, and as a direct consequence of this, less time for testing. And I think taking a step back from this, comparing this to more traditional information technology product development cycles, we're seeing a very large difference. And in IBM's case, we've started to take steps to address some of the problems that are occurring as a result of this, significantly building testing into the development cycle in a manner so that people on the development floor can actually run meaningful tests on their code, and taking significant amounts of time out of the testing cycle by automation. Now, I'm going to hand over now to my colleague to give some more information about some of the specific solutions that we have in this area.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Roberts, and I'm the second speaker today on this webcast. My role in IBM is that I'm an IT specialist within the Rational brand of IBM Software Group, and I spend most of my time working with customers on automated deployment and release solutions and the wider software development lifecycle solutions from the Rational brand. So I want to pick up from where Chris has left off there and start talking about some of the development challenges that organizations face when they try to achieve some of the things to support the industry, the pace of change, the environment, and the customers that Chris has just been talking about. And really this term DevOps that we hear spoken of quite frequently these days, it really came out of the compression of two distinct sort of creative behaviors. On the left-hand side here, we've got the development activities, gathering requirements, writing code, unit test, and so on, and build. And a lot of the things that we want from the engineers working in those areas is really creative, new thinking, new ways to do things, innovation, bringing new things to the market. And over on the right-hand side, we've got operations, where we have the more procedural rigor, and where we don't really want huge elements of new innovation and creative thinking. We want to follow a prescriptive way of working in operations, where we're repeating the same thing again and again. And that was fine in waterfall development, where we had the profiles that are shown there, and we had a clean handover to operations. But as you move more towards an agile development process, what we have is a blending of the roles, and we reach this crossover point where development and operations need to work a little bit closer together, and it's that gap in the middle which has often been described as DevOps. So how do we get those two conflicting views of the world to try to work together, and what sort of things can we do to improve that? Well, if we look across the software development lifecycle, what we see is four sort of really distinctive areas for how we can communicate with our customers, develop the application, and get it into operational running. Excuse me, it helps to mute the phone if you're going to sneeze. So here we show in four main areas, and there are two gaps that develop in this area. We have the gap between the line of business and the development team, that's the first gap, and then we have another gap between the development teams and operations. And if you think about some of the main characteristics of Agile development and what Agile development has tried to do, it really has closed that first gap. We have more line of business representatives working on development teams, getting a closer view of how the development teams operate, the sorts of challenges and risks and issues that they face, and better communication from the development team to the line of business through those stakeholders and representatives. We're showing the line of business the applications that are being developed on a much more frequent basis, getting rapid feedback rather than waiting months and months and months to show someone an application and hear the words, well, that's not quite what I meant. And that's working really well. But if we turn our attention to the other gap now, this has probably really been made a little bit worse by the successes of Agile development and the improvements to the first gap. And if we look at Agile development, what we have is teams creating continuous integration processes where as soon as the developer commits a line of code into their application, into their shared source code repository, whatever that might be, a build will be started and new executables will be produced. But it's there that we have a huge so what moment, because the build has been produced, and what does that tell us? Well, it tells us for some teams that that's a huge success because they actually managed to integrate and build some code. But realistically, that doesn't prove that the application is working properly. What we need to do is get the application deployed into some production-like environment so that it can go through some more rigorous testing, so that we can test the functionality. Does it do what it should? We can test the performance. Does it do what it should when 1,000 people a second all try to log on? Similar example, the examples that were on the news all this week, various organizations struggling to cope on Black Monday earlier this week, when we had the big rush of everyone to get online and buy Christmas presents. I'm hugely hyped up by the press, I think, and lots of people probably wouldn't have gone shopping if they hadn't have been hearing on the news that it was the big Christmas shopping day on Monday. But it happened, and what we saw was a lot of websites that couldn't cope. And that leads to those customers who couldn't get on the site going elsewhere. And as Chris said, you can't scale your entire infrastructure year on year out and run it at the size of organization that you need for Black Monday. That doesn't work. So besides being agile in development, we need to be more agile in operations and think about how we can take on additional resource and take on additional computing power such that we can cope with those sorts of peaks in demand, whether it be for the final 3 days before the Grand National, European Cup final, the FA Cup final, the Olympics, or whether it's ticket sales going on sale for a Robbie Williams concert that we know is going to sell out within minutes. The last thing we want to happen is that we're on the news for the website failing. So that performance testing activity and getting some benchmarks out of that is key, and you can only do that by deploying your application. But there's another part to this really, is that we really want to exercise the full extent of the life cycle. If all we're doing is build and test and build and test and build and unit test, we are really only exercising a part of that process, and we know we can do that well because we do it 1,000 times before a release. But if we only deploy into some sort of environment twice during a 3-month development period, then we haven't really gained a great deal of experience. We haven't hit that little glitch of what happens when something goes wrong. So the more we exercise this process and the more continuous delivery we do, getting the thing deployed into some sort of production-like environment on an hourly basis, excuse me, or more frequently if we can, and executing some sort of test, starts to become more familiar to everyone involved. Everyone becomes more aware of what it takes to get the thing deployed. And that's where we start to gain some confidence in the fact that these processes we use here to deploy into development, into QA, to pre-production, they're really good, and we're going to use those processes to deploy into production as well. Now, let's look at the application release process. Well, what does it involve? Well, I'm sure in all your organizations, you deploy to development and you do some tests, deploy to QA, run some more tests, and deploy to production and switch it on, everything's fine, and go home. Well, it may not quite look like that in reality. Let's have a look at what a real release process is more likely to look like. And the more likelihood is that we're going to have some plans and documentation. There'll be the notion of some sort of run book, whereby we'll create a series of manual steps. There'll be some identification there of automated tasks that are to be performed. There might be spreadsheets to record specific tasks and assignments to individual people, and undoubtedly there's always a project plan lurking around somewhere. We're not really sure how out of date it is, but there will be a project plan somewhere. There'll be some manual operations to perform. However much all of us, try to automate what happens in an application release process, we can't automate everything. This is a real good distinction between application deployment and application release. And my definition certainly is that application deployment is the nuts and bolts of the operations to get this particular binary deployed into this particular runtime, or this particular SQL script executed to push some new tables into a database. That is deployment. That is changing the runtime environment that you're using to deliver a service. Application release is the broader set of operations that may take weeks and months to actually do, because planning, reviewing change requests, reviewing that you have the right number of SEV1 defects that are allowed and the right number of SEV2 defects to go into production, you're less likely to automate some of these, and these are a judgment call. Not some things like that, whereby managers are making a decision about what to do. We need to record that. We need to record the decision that was made, the stats at that time, and there'll be other manual things you need to do. Contacting your telecoms provider, asking them to reroute network traffic from one data center to another. It's not an automated task, it is manual. But you will work through this deployment process. There will be things that you can operate as scripted operations, and there might be some manual validation scripts to execute, some further script execution, more manual operations, final switching over of data centers, emailing people for approval, and then there's all that documentation to file away at the end of it. So what do we actually want to achieve in an application release process? Well, really we want to get to a point where we are improving the efficiency and the productivity and the predictability of how we release our applications. And no one's going to disagree with those three sort of characteristics of making improvements in those areas. A lot of release processes are hugely labor intensive, where you have teams of people performing repeated operations, often working on 20 or 30 different machines, doing the same operation to them, What happens if they're distracted after they've done 29 out of 30 and they forget the final one? And we end up with some discrepancy, some inventory out of compliance. So we want to automate as many of these repetitive and boring tasks as we can. And it kind of reminds me there of the story of the aircraft industry. I was told a story a while back that when autopilots were first thought of, they decided that actually autopilots should control the takeoff and landing process, because those are the most critical parts of the flight, and the boring bit in the middle we'll let the pilot deal with. And I don't know how true this story is, but it's quite an interesting tale. And finally somebody said, well, actually we need some human intervention and some sharp-eyed responses during takeoff and landing, where you could suddenly get a gust of wind blowing the aircraft around, a sudden drop, and we need some rapid response to that. But the boring bit in the middle, the hours and hours and hours flying across the Atlantic, we'll let the autopilot do that. And that's what we want here, really. We want to automate as many of the repeated, boring operations as we possibly can, because they will run so much faster, so much more reliably, and so much more repeatable. We want to discover defects as early as we can in the life cycle, and this comes back to the point really about trying to get things deployed into some sort of production-like environment as soon as we can. Now, I'm not asking you all to go and create a huge infrastructure that matches exactly what your production systems look like. You can do this on a very, very small scale of infrastructure on virtualized machines and get things running in some sort of representative environment very quickly. So your development and your initial QA environments might consist of just perhaps an application server and a database server. When you get to pre-production, you may have a load balancer introduced. You might start to segregate out your application server into multiple machines and multiple database servers. And finally, when you get to production, you might have a much larger scale of machines, whereby you've got tens of application servers. And when it's approaching the Grand National, you might ramp that up to 100 application servers. But regardless of what the actual deployment infrastructure looks like, the actual nuts and bolts of the operations to deploy should remain the same. And that's what we try to achieve. Because the last thing you want to do is have a different process for deploying to production. And it's what I hear so many times. When I go into customers, they will describe one mechanism they use for deploying into the first few environments, the first development environments, and test, and then they'll say, oh yeah, but production's different because it's at a larger scale. So the scripts we use for deploying into QA won't work. So in that scenario, how do we test the production deployments? We have to deploy to production, of course. So that's the last thing we want to do. We really want to get away from that process and get more consistent processes that are used throughout the whole of the life cycle. But basically, we want to lower the risk by decreasing the variance of software projects and try and standardize the processes that we use, provide traceability throughout the life cycle, so that we can hold up an individual built object and say, how was this built? What changes are included in this particular build? What requirements do those changes relate to? What new functionality are we implementing in this particular release? And many organizations can do that, can answer those questions, but for many organizations it involves another highly inefficient, highly labor-intensive process to go and manually find that information. And finding that information in a more automated process, in a much faster process, allows people to understand the risk, understand the scale of change, and the likely impact of this on their deployment environments. It also allows us to do much more focused testing, because yes, you probably want to run regression testing through across your entire application, but it also does facilitate the opportunity to do more focused testing on a specific area of your application. Let's have a look at the total cost of ownership breakdown, and this came from an IBM study that was done over a number of customers over the last couple of years. So we've got the cost of the implementation, which is about 21% there, and the cost of operations, which is 79%. So the ongoing running costs and maintenance outweigh the cost to actually deliver the service in the first place quite considerably. Now, if we put a little marker on here against all of the items that are involved with application release, that adds up to 83% of the total cost of ownership. Now, I'm not trying to suggest here that you are going to take out that 83% by providing better release management and better deployment automation. That would be foolish. But I will kind of highlight these things here as there are 83% of the total cost of ownership sort of areas of work that can be impacted by poor deployment automation and by slow release management. So improving how we release our applications is going to lower the cost of our test activities. It's going to lower the cost of the code maintenance because we can test much more rapidly, and we can test at a lower cost because of our infrastructure setup costs that we have to keep doing again and again and again to get a QA environment set up. We don't do that anymore because we maintain those environments in a much more manageable state, in a much cleaner and tidier state. And our application upgrades, well, we dramatically reduce the costs of those because they get done once. Some 45% of application releases actually get rolled back a few hours after they've been put into place, get fixed, and then deployed again. So trying to avoid all those rollbacks by doing more automated testing in production-like environments can make a huge difference. So let's have a look at improving the application deployment process a little bit. I'll go into this a little bit further. We want to take control of all the resources that are used and lower the administrative burden on environment management. Now, one of the ways that we can do this is the fact that when our solutions are in place, we find that we have less fingers in the pies, less people poking around in those test systems, less people logging on and doing remote access to systems, because they don't need to. There's no need to log on to those 30 machines and get a log file off to find out if something happened successfully, because there are better ways to find that sort of information out. One of the great examples of this was a customer who told me recently that he changed the WebSphere administration console password to stop people using it. And he thought he would do a bit of an experiment and see how long it took before someone came and asked him for it. And if you're not familiar with WebSphere, then basically there is one console that you go through. It's a web console to manage the WebSphere environment, and you can deploy things through that. You can change settings through that, and basically make all sorts of changes that you want to. And he wanted to stop people from doing that and making those changes in that way. And he wanted them to use an automated deployment solution instead. It was 2 months before anybody asked him for the password. And the reason for that was that they had completely changed how they interacted with that runtime environment. All of their deployments, all of their property changes, all of their stopping and starting and removing and adding was all done through an automated solution. All audited, all controlled, all tracked, and much, much better controls. So that gives you better reuse, gives you better availability, and we don't have the problem anymore of people waiting and waiting and waiting for a new environment to be provisioned. It can all be done so much faster. We want to implement consistent processes across all our environments, and I've said this probably twice already, I'm pretty sure. This is the third time, just bang the drum again, of using exactly the same deployment processes through all environments right up to and including production, and locking down resources so that we have a consistent approach to how we do the deployments, how we get log files off, how we do inspections, and so on, those types of operations. And this gives us the opportunity to introduce a layer of security and governance that people don't have today across their application deployment activities. Because for many people, it's log on to this particular box and go and run a shell script, or run this command through this GUI here and drag this file across and drop that broker archive file into that directory, and it will start to run. Similar things happen around Tomcat and so on. And you don't have a great deal of control, and you certainly don't have much governance and recording of who did what, where, and when. We control access to those environments. They stay in a more pristine condition for longer, get more value from them, and we get a better inventory to show our auditors about who did what, where, and when. And we can simplify access to the complex functionality within your servers and application environments and try and hide some of that by using a plugin ecosystem that allows people to get access to functions like stopping and starting and deploying and removing. I know very little. Let me give you another example. I know very little about IBM data power devices, and if you don't either, then that's not a problem at all. But I was working with data power devices recently through one of our deployment solutions, and using the plugins that we provide, was guided through the types of operations you can perform. So getting information from that device, making changes to those settings and redeploying it back, I was doing that within about 3 hours. So you start to meet new technologies, and if someone is providing a guiding hand through the types of activities you can perform through simple plug-in steps, then you stand a better chance of being able to deliver on what you need to do with that particular technology. Let's change things around now and focus on application release processes for the last part of my slide, and then we're going to take some questions after this slide. Basically here we want to take control of the release plan. Everybody has a release plan. It may be in a spreadsheet, a Microsoft project plan. It might be in a Word document. I've seen various different types, and I've seen some that are actually really, really good. There's nothing wrong with them, but they are single user technologies. They are very slow to update. They don't provide real-time tracking of who is doing which particular operation and hasn't yet been completed. And the sequencing of operations, these tasks can only start when those other ones have completed. Now, you might document that on a Microsoft project plan, but in reality, do we actually enforce that and weave that into the automated operations as well? So this is an opportunity to provide accurate and real-time statistics on the progress of activities, on any delays, and identify who's responsible for each particular task. And really want to move this to a common database-centric view of the live plan during a release, so everybody is informed and everyone has much better visibility. We also want to facilitate feedback, because when 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning and you've worked through the night from Friday and you're partway through release, the last thing you're going to do is take a note of that new thing that you've spotted that needs to be done that isn't currently on the plan. You might think, oh yeah, I need to write that down or send an email to someone about that so that we get that new line item added to the plan. Well, if we add it in during a live running release, then we can feed that back and provide a feedback loop back into the master plan template after that release has completed. There are some great things that we can do to identify the reality of what a release is. You know, a release is not all automation. A release includes manual tasks. It includes things that are done sequentially and some things that are done in parallel. And it will include some delays, and it will include some things that go wrong and need to be put right, and we need to improve our planning as we go. Continuous feedback is something that most Agile teams want. We can also manage the application pipeline. When we describe application deployment to many customers, they often say, well, that's great. That shows me how I can deploy that particular application. But actually, in my world, I've got 30 applications I need to deploy as a sequenced operation in sets together. I need to control and manage the release of 30 applications into various different environments and know where I am on that view. Well, this is where the management of a portfolio of applications becomes really critical, so that you can identify things that can be released as a unit. And you will be managing different versions of various different content, so can you guarantee that all of those versions that you're deploying have been through all of the environments they need to go through? Have they picked up all the qualitative markers on them, the stickers along the way, the stamps that identify that they have gone through a QA process in a pre-production environment, and that version of that particular content is definitely now ready to go into the production environment. And the final thing for me really is around environment management. We meet a lot of customers who talk about the various different hundreds and hundreds of servers that they have within their operating environments that are badly utilized, and they occasionally run for about 2 or 3% utilization, and then they're idle again when someone has completed the test. So we want to control access to those environments and get more from them. We also want to identify things like blackout periods and system unavailability periods, particularly around our production environments. I suspect that there weren't many retailers doing big upgrades of their systems this week or over last weekend. So the likelihood is that they would have had, you know, we are in December now, this is the retail blackout, they won't want to talk to anyone, they won't want to do any upgrades, they just want to keep the lights on and keep things running. And I'm sure you have similar periods within your own particular industries around critical points of the year. And finally, reservations, booking systems and making sure that you get the system you need at the right time for your particular phase of your project allows you to stay on track and make sure that you get everything done without the gaps, without the waiting, without the dead time, introducing waste into how you develop your product and get it out into production. So I hope that part's been useful from me. I hope Chris's part was useful as well. What I think we now have to do is hand it back to Paul Hancock, and Paul's going to manage the Q&A for us.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Chris. Really, really interesting insight into what's happening in the market, and then great overview as to what we're seeing from a DevOps perspective. So we've got a couple of questions. The first one is, where should we start with DevOps? Mark, can you take that one?
Yeah, sure. It's something that often comes up with a lot of customers is, first off, we'll often have a conversation about what DevOps is and what it actually means. And let's just cover that one off very briefly, in that, to my mind, really, DevOps is about the compression of the teams together and bringing more people into the same team so that we're all operating to the same objectives. And having developers have a better understanding of how the application is deployed. I've often said that you need, as a developer, you need to be able to sketch out the architecture of your applications and the building blocks that go together from the ground up, from the operating system, the next middleware layer, the next application layer on top of that, how it interacts with external systems and databases. And you should be able to sketch all that out. You should also be able to describe the runtime environment. And I think making more developers aware of what the runtime environment is and how the application is deployed can only be a good thing and can only improve things. So where to start really with DevOps, I would think, is to have a look at what's introducing the gaps and the delays into how you're deploying your application now. What's introducing the inconsistencies in the process? Do you use the same process for deployments into development and QA, pre-production and production? And most organizations we meet, the answer to that is no. And then we start to ask people about, well, if you want to make changes to your deployment operations, who do you go to? How easy is it to do that? And how comfortable are you in making those changes? And from that, we start to identify that there are critical resources that people often don't really understand that well. And focusing on that and trying to, what's the word I'm looking for really? Demystify, that's it. Try and demystify how deployments currently operate and move them to a more simplistic model is the best way to start. So start with how you're currently deploying, examine that. Start with a better understanding about how things need to be deployed, and then move forward from there, from the development environment into QA, into production, and then snowball forward from there.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. And the second question we had through is, what recurring challenges do you see within your gaming customers? And Chris, can I hand that one to you?
Sure, yeah. I think probably the challenge we've seen more often than anything else is the challenge on the development teams. So almost every customer in the sector that I've spoken to has remarked that testing, engaging in a rigorous test cycle, going through several different phases of test is actually no longer possible given the requirements of the business. So that without a doubt that's the most common one that I've seen.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris, and thanks for that. So I think we just got the final slide, which is talking about next steps. Yeah, so we've got some next steps available to you where you can gain a greater insight into DevOps. These are, firstly, Range 4 run regular breakfast briefings covering DevOps. These 2-hour sessions cover how to get started with the DevOps and provide you with an opportunity to network with other customers. And secondly, in conjunction with IBM, we will be running Urban Code and Green Hat one-day hands-on proof of technology sessions in London. These dates will be confirmed shortly. And finally, at Range of 4, we run a DevOps maturity assessment where we look at the people, process and tooling across your organization. The goal of the assessment is to provide a baseline of your current state and a number of recommendations for improvement. For further details, please contact myself, Paul Hancock. So I just wanted to wrap up and say thanks to Chris and Mark for a great presentation, great insight into what's happening within the gaming industry and a great overview of DevOps. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and thank you for attending today's webcast. Bye for now.